Good day, everybody. I will be giving a short overview on the food and nutrition security in South Africa within the context of sustainable diets. South Africa is one of the countries globally that suffers the triple burden of malnutrition, and this is based on the coexistence of overweight in women, the prevalence of anemia in women of reproductive age, and the prevalence of stunting in children under 5. So we have nearly 2/3 of women who are either overweight or obese, and 1/3 who have anemia. And although we do not have recent data on the vitamin A and iodine deficiencies, there are indications that these deficiencies are still prevalent. In terms of children under 5, 27% are stunted, and this remains consistently high. 13% are overweight, and about 1/3 have anemia. Again, as for the women, we do not have recent data on vitamin A deficiency and zinc deficiency, but there are indications that these deficiencies still remain. This slide shows the percentage of children under 5 who are stunted, as well as the percentage of women who are either overweight or obese, sorted according to the wealth quintiles from the lowest to the highest. And this shows that the prevalence of stunting is highest in the lowest wealth quintile, whereas the prevalence of overweight and obesity in women is the highest in the higher wealth quintile. However, we do need to note that even in the lowest wealth quintile, more than 50% of women are overweight or obese. The coexistence of the different forms of malnutrition we can relate back to the diet. The South African diet can be described as a diet with little variety. It is mostly cereal-based. Intake of fruits and vegetables is low. Intake of dairy products is low. And over the years, the intake of sugar-sweetened beverages and sugary foods, salty snacks and processed foods have increased. And this is currently an integral part of the diet. And the intake of these unhealthy foods already starts very early during childhood. And this is reflected by data from the 2016 South African Demographic and Health Survey, which showed that 18% of children under the age of 2 consumed sugary drinks, nearly 1/3 sugary foods, and 44% salty snacks the previous day. We have differences, geographical differences in terms of dietary intake across the country. And I'm just going to illustrate this with this slide, which illustrates data for 2 rural sites and 2 urban sites. The 2 rural sites were in KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo, and the 2 urban sites, the Northern Cape and the Western Cape. And if we look at the macronutrient energy distribution for these diets, we can see that the rural diet has a higher percentage of energy from carbohydrates and a lower percentage of fat compared to the urban diet. In terms of protein, there's not much difference in the percentage of energy from protein between rural and urban, but the type of protein differs, as illustrated by the different ratios for the plant of animal to and plant protein. For the rural areas in rural KZN, the diet contained about 3 times more plant protein than animal protein, and even differences across the 2 rural areas where Limpopo was only 1.5 times higher plant protein compared to animal protein, compared to the urban sites, which had a higher intake of animal protein compared to plant protein. We can also see the geographical differences in terms of micronutrient intakes, as well as the reliance on the National Food Fortification Program. And I will illustrate this by using one example of vitamin A intake. The dark bar part of the bar indicates the amount of vitamin A which was provided by either fortified maize meal or fortified bread, which are the two staple foods fortified according to the National Food Fortification Program. And this clearly shows that in the rural sites, children receive a larger amount of vitamin A from these fortified staples compared to the urban sites. And children in rural areas therefore rely much more on the National Food Fortification Program for adequate micronutrient intake compared to urban. Because we have these different forms of malnutrition coexisting in the country, it is important that when we address one form of malnutrition, that we should not increase the risk for any of the other types of malnutrition. And this is referred to as double duty actions. At the same time, we need to look at sustainable healthy diets. And sustainable diets can be described as diets that promote all dimensions of health and well-being, have low environmental impact, is accessible, affordable, safe, and equitable to all, and is also culturally acceptable. So sustainable healthy diets have four domains, and there's a complex interaction between these four domains, between nutrition and health, the environment, the economics, and the society. And these four domains also differ depending on location. So we could get that in certain circumstances, like in countries or areas where childhood malnutrition is still prevalent, that there will be a trade-off between nutrition and health and the environment, so that a greater focus is placed on improving the diet and the health of the children. Part of a sustainable diet, we need a sustainable food system. And the food system refers to all activities related from food production right to the point where the food is consumed. So we have the agricultural activities, and then post-harvest, food are processed and packaged. It then goes to the wholesalers and the retailers, and at the end, it is consumed either at home or in feeding schemes, school feeding programs, restaurants, etc. And all of the activities are related to storage. At each stage, there is storage of the food involved, as well as disposing of the food waste and food loss. And in some cases, how is this food loss, how is this recycled? We also need to keep in mind that in this line from production, processing, wholesale, and consumption, there's always transport involved as well as trade. So any factors that will affect any of these activities will have an effect on the food system. And the food system then operates within the socio-economic, political, and biophysical environments. The outcome from the food system is firstly food security to the people of the country. And food security refers to whether people have access to food, where the food is available, and the utilization of the food. And a country can be food secure, such as South Africa, but because of an unequal accessibility of these foods, we have large proportions of the population that are actually food insecure. The food system has a two-way interaction with socioeconomic factors as well as the environment. So a big focus is currently on sustainable healthy diets, and probably the most known one is the Eat Lancet Commission, which was published, which is basically focused primarily on foods from plant sources. There's an optional option for consuming modest amounts of poultry and eggs, and it also recommends low intakes of red meat, if any, especially processed meat. So overall, it recommends a very low intake of poultry, eggs, and red meat. The fats are based mostly on the healthy fats, carbohydrates primarily from whole grains, low intake of the refined grains, and a low intake of energy from sugar. The recommendations for fruits and vegetables 5 servings per day, which is similar to the recommendation of the World Health Organization of 5 portions or 400 grams per day, which is needed to reduce the risk for both non-communicable diseases as well as micronutrient deficiencies. Another component of the Eat Lancet Commission diet is the low or moderate consumption of dairy, but there's also the option of no intake of dairy. So this is a very restrictive type of intake in terms of animal source foods. So if we compare these guidelines with the South African intake, the red dots are for South Africa. The blue dots, which are open, is global. And then the targets are the gray areas, and they fall below the target or above the target. They are in the white areas. So if we start at the bottom of the graph, we can see red meat more than 200% above the maximum target for red meat intake in South Africa. Is not unique here, as we can see globally, regional and sub-regional, all the countries are above the 200% of the target. In terms of dairy and fish, those are the only 2 foods that are within the target of the Lancet diet. With dairy, we just need to keep in mind that the recommendation or the target is extremely low. And the other targets for fruit, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and whole grains are all below the target. So it is very clear from this slide that drastic changes will be needed if we need to comply to this type of dietary intake. We also need to keep in mind that not all healthy diets are sustainable, and not all sustainable diets are healthy. And Himmler et al., they concluded that healthy plant-based diets can be customized to fit individual and cultural preferences, and with large-scale adoption could concurrently mitigate threats to both human and environmental health. With other words, taking into account the society and the economic domains of sustainable diets. The question, though, is what is a plant-based diet? Now, plant-based diets are promoted primarily on evidence that is available, that diet rich in plant foods and with lower intake of animal source foods has both benefits for health as well as the environment. But the question remains, what is a plant-based diet? And if we look in the literature, the current literature, I don't think there's any definition that is consistent. Very strictly speaking, a plant-based diet will have no foods from animal source foods, with other words, a vegan diet, but a vegan diet may not necessarily be healthy. A plant-based diet in the literature is also often referred to as the vegetarian diets, or all the different types of semi-vegetarian diets. There's also dietary patterns that emphasize the intake of plant foods, such as the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. But we need to keep in mind that there's a difference between a Mediterranean diet and a DASH diet, where, for instance, the DASH diet has a very clear guideline on salt intake, as it is focused on hypertension, when in the Mediterranean diet, olive oil is a unique feature, and we can therefore not directly compare these 2 dietary patterns. In epidemiological studies where they look at the association between plant-based dietary intakes and health outcomes, currently they use plant-based dietary indexes, which are based on the intake of the healthy plant-based foods as well as the animal source foods. And these indicators are calculated based on quintile distributions for all the different food items, which are then scored. And the score is therefore relative. There's no predefined cutoff value, and it's relative to within that specific population, which makes comparisons between studies more difficult. Currently, there's also a big focus shifting towards analyzing data using principal component analysis to derive dietary patterns. And these can be either food patterns or it could be nutrient patterns. And these patterns are data driven, whereas the researcher then identify the factors with high loadings and give them arbitrary names. And often some of these dietary patterns are referred to as plant-based dietary patterns, but we cannot equate a plant-based dietary pattern with a plant-based diet. We also need to keep in mind that not all plant-based foods are healthy. So if we talk about sustainable healthy diets, it focuses on the healthy unprocessed plant foods. It does not include the unhealthy plant-based foods, which are mostly the processed foods that come from plants. So if we then look at a general description of what a healthy diet is, it starts early in life with optimal breastfeeding practices in the first 2 years. It includes a diverse and abundance of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, fibers, nuts, and seeds, modest amount of animal source foods, and minimal amounts of processed meats, foods high in energy, free sugar, saturated fat, trans fat, and salt. So if we then go to the South African context, this is data from the 2016 South African Demographic and Health Survey. The top graph line shows the prevalence of breastfeeding. And we see that about 80% of the mothers initiate breastfeeding. So there's about 20% of babies in South Africa who were never breastfed. Up to 12 months, it's about 50%. Half of the children are still being breastfed. And if we look at 24 months, a very low percentage are breastfed and therefore achieve the recommendations of breastfeeding for at least 24 months. In terms of exclusive breastfeeding, we start with a low number of babies that are exclusively breastfed, less than half. And the recommendation is 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, and it is therefore clear that very few babies in South Africa meet this recommendation of exclusive breastfeeding. What we see in the studies that we do on infants and young children is that once the mother stops breastfeeding or stops with the formula milk feeding, these feeds are not replaced with milk feeds. And we've shown in Northwest Province, for instance, that at 12 and 18 months, 75% of children had a calcium intake below the estimated average requirement. So this low intake of calcium is a great concern at this young age, particularly as a recent South African study showed that a low intake of calcium and vitamin D is associated with stunting in 2 to 5-year-old children. And the authors attributed this association mostly to the low intake of milk. Now, the low calcium intake is not unique to the very young children. This is a slide from Gauteng and the Western Cape, where we can see the intake for 1 to 3, 4 to 6, and 6 to 10-year-old children. And again, most of the children in all 3 age groups have a calcium intake below the estimated average requirement, but at the same time, nearly all of them have an intake of vitamin D, which is also below the estimated average requirement. They reported information on dairy intake, and it clearly showed that as the children grow older, the dairy intake is lower. The low intake in milk and milk products has also been shown in the peer study of Northwest Province, and the study reported the results for 2005 and 2010, which shows an increase in milk and milk product intake from 2005 to 2010 in both urban and rural women, but it also illustrates that in urban women, the intake is higher than in rural women. The guidelines for milk and milk products is 2 portions per day. And if we look at the pure data 2005 and 2010, although there is an increase in the percentage of the study participants who met the recommendation of 2 portions per day, these figures are still extremely low. It is therefore important that an increased intake of milk and milk products or dairy is encouraged in the South African population. However, with an increased intake, it will also have an increased impact on the environment. And Tronovsky argued that in cases like these, we have to weigh the environmental impact to the high nutrient density of the milk and milk products, and we will therefore have a trade-off between the impact on nutrition and health versus the impact that it will have on the environment. The food-based dietary guidelines for South Africa clearly states that we should have milk, mass, or yogurt every day, and the focus of the food-based dietary guideline is very much on low-fat milk, mass, and yogurt. We do, however, need to take cognizance that currently in the market for all 3 of these products, the fat content can vary considerably from a low fat to a double cream. And we also have a very high number of products on the market which are flavored and often sweetened. And although these sugar-sweetened dairy products provide calcium to the diet, they're also considered as sugar-sweetened beverages. This slide shows the food groups consumed by adults. Although the data is slightly old, we do not have more updated data, but it clearly shows the trend in terms of food groups that were consumed the previous day, where nearly all the participants consumed cereals, fruits, and tubers, and that is why we say it's a cereal-based diet. And then interesting to note that dairy is the third most frequently consumed food group. However, as seen on the previous slide, the amount that is being consumed is extremely low. The food group that is the least consumed, and this is also shown in smaller localized studies, is vitamin A-rich fruits and vegetables. And if we look at the food-based dietary guideline, the overall guideline states eat plenty of vegetables and fruit every day. Within the guideline, it is stated that everyone should have 1 vegetable or fruit a day that provides beta-carotene, or the precursor of vitamin A. So we're not near to this guideline. The overall intake of fruits and vegetables is also very low. It's below 200 grams per day, which is half the recommendation of 400 grams, which the WHO recommends. This slide shows intake of fruits and vegetables across the wealth quintiles, which shows that the lowest intake, or the lowest proportion of the population who consumes fruits and vegetables, are in the lower wealth quintiles, while those in the higher wealth quintiles have a higher proportion of the population who consumes fruits and vegetables. Whereas if we compare it to sugar-sweetened beverages, it's only in the lowest quintile where we have a slightly lower proportion of the population who consume sugar-sweetened beverages, and thereafter the proportions remain very similar. And this higher intake of fruits and vegetables across the quintiles illustrates the difficulty that people in the lower quintiles will have to afford fruits and vegetables because of cost. A study in Western Cape and Eastern Cape, also part of the PURE study, showed that those who purchase sugar-sweetened beverages daily were less likely to eat 2 or more portions of fruits and vegetables, again showing that we need to look at the overall diet and not at one component on its own. Because of the low intake of fruits and vegetables, and because of the known association of low intake of fruits and vegetables with non-communicable diseases as well as micronutrient deficiencies, we therefore need to increase the intake of vegetables and fruit in South Africa. Probably the way of doing this that has the lowest impact on the environment will be through indigenous foods or local production of fruits and vegetables. Then we can also buy these fruits and vegetables from supermarkets, and the first picture in the middle, or the middle picture on the top row, is fruits and vegetables that are unpackaged in a supermarket, whereas the bottom two pictures indicate where we have vegetables packaged in a plastic packet, or more the convenient side where fruits are already chopped up and packaged in plastic containers. We need to keep in mind that fruits and vegetables are perishable, so we have a higher waste because they need to be stored properly. We need refrigeration, for instance. Packaging is important, and if we have a lot of packaging within plastic, this will have pollution of the environment with plastic. So we need to take into account not only the environmental impact of increased fruits and vegetables from the agricultural side, but also in terms of how these fruits and vegetables are distributed, packaged, and bought. We can use nutrient profiling to identify foods which gives us the best nutrients compared to cost. This shows at the x-axis is the median energy density of the food per 100 kilocalories per 100 grams, whereas the y-axis shows the nutrient density of the food, which is based on nutrient profiling. So the higher the value, the more nutrient dense the food is. And this clearly shows that vegetables and fruit have a high nutrient density, therefore it's very nutrient rich, but it's also low in energy density. And this is basically what we then would want in the diet. Whereas if we compare it to sweets and fats, it's not rich in nutrients, but it is rich in energy. If we then take the nutrient density of the food, which is on the x-axis, and compare it to the median cost of the food per 100 kilocalories, we can see that the foods sort of just flip over to the other side of the graph. If we look at fruits and vegetables, they provide a lot of nutrients, but they also are foods that have the highest cost per 100 kilocalories. And this is then illustrates, I think, very well why many people cannot afford to buy fruits and vegetables compared to, say, sweets and fats. At the bottom of the bar, they do not provide many nutrients. It's not nutrient rich, but it provides the best source of energy in terms of cost. So this is the cheapest source of energy. We can also then use this sort of nutrient profiling to compare sweets with, for instance, grains. And they have the most nutrient, the same energy cost, but grains have a higher nutrient density. With other words, compared to sweets, grains would be the better option if we had to choose for the same amount of money whether we should buy sweets or grains. And these values are based on American values, but we will see similar trends for South African data. Price of food is the main consideration that people take into consideration when they purchase food. And this is data showing from the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, specifically for KwaZulu-Natal. And they showed that the households prioritize certain core foods in the household food basket, and this makes up for about 53% of the household food basket and includes the staple food, starchy foods, sugar beans, chicken pizzas, oil, teas, and salt. And then depending on the amount of money that is left, that will decide whether they buy meat, eggs, dairy, vegetables, fruit, peanut butter, and pilchards. So any incident that affect the amount of money that they have available for food will of course then affect whether they buy the more nutritious foods or not. So if the food prices go up, they will have less money for the more nutritious foods like meat, eggs, or dairy. Similar, or if they lose their jobs, they become unemployed, they will again have less money available to buy these nutritious foods. This is my last slide, coming back to the first slide that I showed in terms of the coexistence of overweight, anemia, and stunting in South Africa. And at the same time, the Global Nutrition Report indicated that South Africa has made no progress in terms of most of the indicators, and in some cases actually has worsened. So there's a big need for changes in the South African diet, but within the context of sustainability and health. Thank you.